They told me to sign and leave quietly, but I signed something else and they had no idea. Sign this or you'll never work in medicine again. Those were the exact words that shattered the silence in the executive conference room on the 10th floor of Northlake Medical Center. The room smelled of antiseptic and tension. At the far end of the long mahogany table sat Dr. Emily Grant, and across from her, leaning forward with the certainty of unchecked power, was the hospital's chief operating officer, Dr. Martin Sloan. The resignation letter lay between them like a trap. His manicured finger tapped the top of the page slowly rhythmically as if daring her to disobey. His other hand gripped the armrest of his chair a little too tightly. Behind her, through the frosted glass, she could see two security guards pretending not to listen. There were no HR reps, no witnesses. Just a veiled threat wrapped in professionalism. Emily stared at the document. The words voluntary resignation burned into her vision. For a moment the room narrowed. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from rage she had trained herself for months to suppress. Martin's voice dropped to a whisper. This is the cleanest way out for both of us. But this wasn't the beginning of the story. This was just the end of their version. Mine began long before this moment, the day I realized the truth was worth more than my job. Let me rewind. My name is Dr. Emily Grant, and until 4 days ago, I was the head anesthesiologist at Northlake Medical, a prestigious hospital in Oregon, known for its research funding and innovation in surgical practices. I had worked there for 7 years. I had trained interns, created protocols that reduced post-op complications, and was featured on 2 industry panels. But none of that mattered when I asked the wrong question at the wrong time. It started with one invoice, one piece of paper. A few months back, during a routine supply audit, I noticed a vendor receipt for an anesthesia machine listed at $243,000, triple the standard cost. I flagged it, confused, then dismissed it. Maybe it was a coding error. Maybe I didn't understand procurement. But then another one came, and another, and the equipment. They were different brands, lower quality, sometimes malfunctioning mid-surgery. So I asked questions. Not loudly, not yet. Just quiet inquiries to the admin office. The answers were either vague, delayed, or avoided altogether. Then my schedule began to change. I was pulled from the surgical wing and reassigned to overnight ER backup shifts, the kind no one wanted. My name disappeared from the list of contributors on a published research paper, the one I had drafted. At first I thought it was random. But randomness doesn't erase your badge access to the OR, or reroute your emails to a temp admin. Someone was trying to erase me. I still remember the Thursday morning I saw my office lights flickering. Inside, my framed certifications had been removed. My desk drawers had been emptied and replaced with boxes. No note. No meeting scheduled. Just a silent message. You don't belong here anymore. That was the moment I stopped wondering. I started preparing. You see, when institutions try to scare you into silence, they expect you to fold. They count on you being tired, isolated, and ashamed. What they don't count on is documentation. If you've ever been in a room where people talked over your truth, where decisions about your life were made without your voice, then this story is for you. Because what I signed that day wasn't the end. It was the beginning. If you've ever been pushed toward a decision you didn't choose, if you've ever had to keep quiet just to survive, leave a like and stay with me. You won't want to miss what happened next. I didn't sign blindly. I signed with intention. Because while Martin Sloan smirked, believing he'd just silenced a threat, I had already spent 6 months preparing for that exact moment. Back then, I hadn't planned on fighting back. Not at first. I just wanted answers. I was a doctor, not an investigator. But I was trained to notice patterns, to catch the small fluctuations in vitals before they spiraled into something unmanageable. That instinct, refined through every sleepless residency shift and every emergency intubation, had kept patients alive. Now it was going to keep me alive professionally. It began with late nights. I'd pore over hospital invoices, digging into procurement records the way other people scroll social media. I found it strange that certain vendors' ones I'd never heard of kept popping up, always linked to the same internal code, always signed off by one specific administrator, Ben Holloway, Martin's cousin. I only learned the family tie weeks later, but even then the pieces had started falling together. The numbers didn't lie. Equipment was being purchased at inflated rates, sometimes 5 times higher than the national average. And the strange thing was, none of this equipment was better. Some of it didn't even arrive. I'd go to prep an OR and find we were short on basic supplies. But the reports, the budget, it said we were stocked at full capacity. That's when I started downloading copies. Quietly. I made a folder on a secure drive outside the hospital's system. I encrypted it. I even labeled it with a decoy title, Lecture Notes, 2023. Inside, I documented everything: screen captures, emails, scanned invoices, even locker room conversations that raised red flags. Every time someone tried to isolate me, I wrote it down. Every time someone took credit for my work, I logged the details. I wasn't paranoid. I was methodical. There was one moment that solidified it all, a turning point that made me realize I couldn't walk away quietly. It was the day Dr. Nathan Hodge, a first-year attending, presented a new post-op medication protocol to the board, the exact same one I'd designed and submitted 6 weeks earlier. Every graph, every bullet point, even the exact phrasing I'd used in my email, word for word. When I confronted him privately, he just blinked and said, "Martin told me you were stepping back from projects." That was the moment I understood this wasn't neglect. It was erasure. You don't just get erased professionally. It bleeds into how people look at you in the hallway. It changes how they greet you or don't. Eventually, it makes you start to question your own worth. But I had a compass, and that compass was truth. I went home that night and called my sister, who's a journalist in Denver. She didn't say much at first, just listened. Then she said, "They're not afraid of your silence. They're afraid of your clarity." That stuck with me. And so I got clear. I met with a whistleblower attorney named Mia Rowland, a woman who used to work corporate legal for 2 of the largest hospital systems in the country. I didn't tell anyone, not even my colleagues. Mia read through my documentation, made a few quiet phone calls, and then looked me in the eye. "Emily," she said, "this isn't just retaliation, it's fraud. And they know it." She warned me they'd try to force me out. Not fire me, force me to quit. That way, I'd lose leverage, lose legal standing, and most importantly, lose my voice. That's when we developed the plan. If they pushed me toward resignation, I would sign. But I would alter the language legally, subtly, in a way that changed the entire narrative. But to do that, I had to wait. I had to let them believe they were winning. So I kept going to work. I smiled. I showed up early. I stayed late. I delivered results they couldn't dispute. And all the while, I kept building my case not just with evidence, but with composure. If you've ever had to smile through sabotage or hold your ground while they tried to shake your confidence, drop a comment, you're not alone, and your clarity might be exactly what someone else needs to find their voice too. When you're being slowly erased, the cruelty isn't always loud. It's quiet, surgical, intentional. I began noticing the signs long before anyone said a word out loud. First, my weekly case review meetings were rescheduled, always at the last minute, and always at a time I couldn't attend. Then my name began disappearing from shared research folders, documents I had created from scratch. My hospital ID started malfunctioning. Sometimes it wouldn't scan at the physician's lounge, sometimes at the operating room doors. When I emailed IT, they told me it was a system error. But it kept happening. It wasn't just the system that was shutting me out. It was the people. Colleagues I used to laugh with in the break room now averted their eyes. Nurses stopped looping me in on pre-op changes. Junior staff addressed me with formal detachment as though I were already gone, and they were afraid to be associated with a ghost. I still remember walking into the physician's conference room one afternoon and seeing my photo removed from the leadership wall. No explanation, no replacement, just an empty space where my name used to be. I stood there for a long time, not angry, not even sad, just stunned. Because this wasn't a mistake, it was a message. But here's the part no one tells you, even when you know you're being targeted, the hardest part isn't fighting back. It's showing up anyway. So I did. I kept arriving early for morning huddles. I overprepared for every case knowing I was being watched. I maintained a flawless track record even as they tried to find cracks. Every time they closed one door, I found another hallway. Then they made it personal. They started messing with my patients. Twice in 1 month, I found myself assigned to ORs with incomplete prep charts. One day, the anesthetic I had specifically ordered for a high-risk cardiac patient wasn't delivered to the room. I asked the nurse on rotation, and she frowned. It was removed from the cart. Admin override. The override code belonged to someone from procurement, someone who reported directly to Ben Holloway. That same afternoon, I received a written notice from HR citing professional tension with staff and difficulty adapting to evolving department needs. The language was vague, but the message was clear. We're building a case against you, so when we push, you'll fall on your own. But I didn't fall. Instead, I met with Mia again and shared everything: the missing records, the altered carts, the HR notice. She sat quietly as I laid out each thread. When I finished, she said something I'll never forget. They're trying to make you choose between your license and your silence. I could have stayed silent. I could have packed up and disappeared like the others because there were others. Doctors, nurses, even residents who had simply vanished over the past 2 years. Some took jobs out of state. Others left the profession altogether. And I used to wonder why. Now I knew. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was institutional gaslighting. They made you doubt your memory. They blurred the line so you couldn't name the abuse. They wore you down until walking away felt like relief. But I had something different. I had a plan. A patient once told me, "You kept me breathing when I couldn't do it myself." That stayed with me, because in this place where everything felt engineered to suffocate me, I realized I had to do the same for myself. I wasn't just breathing, I was documenting, and I was waiting, because the day was coming. The day they'd try to end it all with a single piece of paper, and when they did, they'd think I was defeated. They wouldn't see what I'd already written between the lines. The final red flag didn't come in the form of a threat. It came in the form of a promotion. A few weeks after the HR warning, I was called into a meeting with Dr. Sloan and the Director of Clinical Operations. The tone was overly warm, practiced, and corporate. "We've been reviewing your recent work," Martin said, lacing his fingers together. "And while some of your interpersonal evaluations have room for growth," he actually smiled here, "we believe you'd be a great fit for our remote patient monitoring initiative." I blinked. The RPMI wasn't a promotion. It was a department that didn't interface with surgical teams, had no patient contact, and operated entirely off-site in a satellite office 30 miles away. They had just rebranded exile into opportunity. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I glanced at the laminated flyer on the table beside me. New Horizons in Patient Autonomy. I looked up, met Martin's eyes, and nodded, like I hadn't just been handed a death sentence for my career. And that's when I knew. The moment was near. That night, I returned home, opened my laptop, and reviewed my resignation folder one more time. The document Mia and I had prepared wasn't just a trapdoor, it was an anchor. I had inserted one legally binding phrase that changed the entire story. Not voluntary resignation, but constructive dismissal due to retaliation for whistleblowing. That one sentence would shift the legal implications completely. If they ever tried to force me out, I would sign their paper. But I would sign my version. I just needed the moment to arrive. It came faster than expected. 3 days later, I was removed from the OR rotation entirely. Not suspended, not fired, just erased from the scheduling system. When I asked about it, the admin shrugged and mumbled something about protocol transitions. Then I was locked out of the anesthesia storage room. My access badge now triggered a red light. Maintenance couldn't explain it. Neither could IT. But the cameras caught me trying to enter. A report followed. They claimed I was accessing restricted areas without clearance, a final strike fabricated out of thin air. And still I smiled, because I saw the storm coming, and I was already in the eye of it. 2 days later, my Outlook calendar populated with a meeting invite titled Status Review Immediate Action Required. No agenda, no explanation, just a room number and a time, Wednesday, 8:00 a.m. Conference Room 3A. I clicked accept without hesitation. That morning, I didn't wear scrubs. I wore a tailored gray suit, the one I had only ever used for industry panels. I brought nothing but my phone and a leather folder. Inside the folder, my letter, my evidence log, and a time-stamped USB. I arrived at 7:57. Outside the room, 2 men in dark polos stood pretending to examine the wall-mounted defibrillator. Security. Not subtle. Martin sat at the far end of the table when I entered. The HR rep, a woman I'd never met, looked uncomfortable. A resignation letter lay face up between them. It was already signed on their end. Dated. Sealed. Martin gestured to the chair across from him and smiled. "Let's make this easy, Dr. Grant." I sat down slowly. I looked at the paper. And I picked up the pen. Then I did exactly what we planned. I crossed out voluntary resignation and wrote my truth in the margins. Constructive dismissal due to documented hostile work environment and whistleblower retaliation. See appended documentation and counsel. Signed, Dr. Emily Grant. 8:04 a.m. Witnessed. I set the pen down and slid the letter back. Martin didn't read it. He simply nodded, satisfied. "Clear your office by end of day," he said. "Security will escort you." "I understand," I replied calmly. "For record purposes, may I confirm that this meeting was initiated by administration?" Martin looked briefly annoyed. "Yes, as documented." "Thank you." I stood up, walked to the door. My heart pounded, but my steps were steady. If you've ever stood at a crossroads and chose integrity over fear, even when it cost you everything, tell me below. I want to know who else has walked through fire and come out holding the truth. The hallway outside Conference Room 3A felt colder than usual. Sterile. Like the air had been filtered one too many times. I walked slowly, each footstep deliberate. My phone, still recording, vibrated twice in my pocket. Messages from Mia, no doubt. She was waiting for confirmation. She had told me, "The moment you walk out, text me, then send everything." I found an empty bench near the stairwell, sat down and took a breath. Only then did the tremors come. Not fear, adrenaline. The kind that surges in your veins when you've just jumped from a cliff and are waiting to feel if your parachute opens. I pulled out my phone, opened the folder, sent the email, Mia, time-stamped resignation letter and complete documentation attached. Let's move. Then I walked to my office for the last time. Inside, it was already half emptied. My surgical posters had been taken down and my credentials removed from the wall. A cardboard box sat on the floor near my desk, almost like someone had prepared it in advance. I packed slowly a coffee mug from my first year of residency, a small framed photo of my dog, a worn leather-bound notebook I used to carry during rounds. Each item had weight, not just physical, but emotional. Proof that I had once belonged here. 20 minutes later, a knock at the door. It was Luis, one of the building's veteran security guards. Late 50s, calm demeanor, ex-Navy. He had always greeted me with a nod, nothing more. "I'm here to escort you," he said, almost apologetically. I figured. He looked at the box in my arms, then reached out. "Let me get that." We walked through the corridors in silence, past nurses I used to joke with, residents who once shadowed me. Some looked away. One or two offered uncertain glances. No one spoke. As we passed the surgical boardroom, Luis leaned in. "For what it's worth," he murmured, "I've seen a lot of people leave this place. Not many leave like you, head high, shoulders straight." I nodded. "Thank you." Before heading to the lobby, I made 2 stops. First, I walked into Human Resources. The director, Karen Huang, looked up, startled. "Dr. Grant." I handed her a sealed envelope. This is a formal complaint of constructive dismissal and whistleblower retaliation, I said clearly. It contains the amended resignation letter signed this morning as well as documented evidence detailing the events that led here. Karen's posture shifted. She glanced at the envelope like it might burn through the desk. My attorney will follow up shortly, I added. She has copies of everything. Karen didn't respond immediately. She only said, "We'll review this thoroughly." I nodded. "I hope you do." The second stop was to the third-floor break room where Alyssa, a surgical scheduler I'd worked closely with, often sat during her lunch. She was there now, sipping tea, scrolling on her phone. She looked up surprised. "I heard." "It's true," I said gently. "But before I go check the inventory records, look for repeated orders from Pacific MedTech with inflated unit costs. Then look at which procedures those supplies are tied to." Alyssa's eyes widened. "Is this about—" I raised a hand. "Just look. Quietly. And be careful who you talk to." I didn't wait for her response. Luis and I walked the rest of the way down. In the main lobby, I paused at the glass doors. It was raining now, soft, steady drops tapping against the concrete. Luis handed me the box. "I hope you come back," he said. I smiled. "I won't need to, because the truth was already back inside, and it was about to make noise." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my apartment balcony with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the city humming softly below. Every few minutes, I checked my phone as if the screen might suddenly light up with some impossible message. "We made a mistake. Come back." But I didn't want to go back. I wanted to move forward. And I wanted them to feel what they had spent months making me feel: invisible, uncertain, afraid. Only this time it would be different. At 7:13 a.m., my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I answered. "Dr. Grant. This is Karen Huang from Human Resources. We've reviewed the materials you submitted and need you to come in for a meeting with senior leadership." I paused. "Am I to understand I'm still employed at Northlake Medical?" A silence. Then, "Your employment status is complicated. The documentation you submitted creates a situation we must address immediately." "I'll be there at 9, I said, "with my attorney." Another pause. "Understood. 14th floor executive conference room." I hung up. Mia met me at a cafe near the hospital an hour later. She wore a charcoal gray suit, hair pulled back, a leather briefcase laid out neatly on the table. "They're rattled," she said without preamble. "I received 3 emails from legal last night, each more desperate than the last. They're not just worried about your claim, they're worried about what else you might have uncovered." I slid her a USB and a hard copy binder. "Everything's in there." She nodded. "They'll try to contain this. Offer you a quiet settlement with confidentiality clauses. Try to pin it all on one person and isolate the blame. But that's not what we're doing." "No," she said firmly. "What we're doing is holding an institution accountable." At 8:57 we entered the main building. Luis was stationed at the front desk. He looked up and gave me a small smile. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Circumstances change," I said, signing in for a visitor's badge. 14th floor has been busy all morning," he added. "Lots of meetings, people looking nervous." In the elevator, Mia reviewed our strategy. "Let them speak first," she said. "We need to see if they're minimizing, denying, or preparing to concede. Don't show your full hand until we hear their position." The 14th floor was unusually tense. Admins shuffled between glass-walled offices carrying armfuls of files. I caught glimpses of 2 executive board members through an open door, faces, pale eyes locked on spreadsheets. Near the conference room, I saw Dr. Theo Ramirez, a physician from internal medicine I had once mentored. He stood speaking with Veronica, a compliance officer. Both looked serious. Theo met my eyes, gave a tiny nod. Mia and I entered. Inside were 5 people: Karen from HR, the hospital's general counsel, the chief operating officer, not Martin, and finally Dr. Evelyn Brooks, Northlake's CEO. Her presence surprised me. She was polished, professional, and famously unshakable. Until today. "Dr. Grant," she began, "we've reviewed your documentation. The contents are deeply concerning." "They're not allegations," I replied calmly. "They're facts. dated, corroborated, and recorded. Their general counsel, a man named Richard Shaw, cleared his throat. Before we proceed, we want to express that Northlake Medical takes workplace conduct very seriously. If Mia interjected coldly, "If you take it seriously, please continue," Dr. Brooks exhaled. "We're not here to dispute Dr. Grant's experiences. We're here to understand the scope." Mia opened her folder and laid it flat. The scope, she said, includes financial improprieties tied to procurement, forged administrative records, and retaliatory behavior by executive staff. We have documentation and legal grounds for a formal complaint with both the State Medical Board and the Attorney General's office. Karen's face paled. Richard looked down at his notes. Dr. Brooks straightened her spine. "What are you seeking, Dr. Grant?" I looked her in the eye. "Truth, accountability, and change. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been silenced." Dr. Brooks leaned forward. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands gave her away, fingers pressed tightly together. Her thumbs twitching slightly as she searched for footing in a room that was no longer hers to control. Across the table, Mia remained perfectly composed. "Our position is simple," Mia said, voice measured. "Your institution enabled a hostile work environment. It failed to act on internal procurement fraud. And now that it's exposed, you're hoping to contain it before it spreads. But this isn't containable. Not anymore." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. Real. Then Dr. Brooks spoke. "If everything you've documented is verified," her voice faltered just slightly, "then disciplinary action will be taken." "You're already late," I said quietly but firmly. "This has been happening for over a year. And I'm not the only one." That was the moment Mia dropped the second binder on the table. A thicker one. "These are the testimonies of 7 additional employees," she said. "Doctors, nurses, and administrative staff, all of whom were targeted, reassigned, or pushed out after raising similar concerns." Dr. Brooks's eyes widened. "You've spoken to them?" "No," I answered. "They spoke to your HR department yesterday afternoon after my documentation was filed." Karen Huang nodded faintly, as if finally acknowledging the weight of what she had helped bury. The legal counsel shifted uncomfortably. "This complicates the narrative." "No," Mia corrected him. "It clarifies it." There was a beat of silence, then Dr. Brooks asked, "What do you want us to do next?" Mia didn't flinch. "Full reinstatement. Back pay. A formal investigation into procurement contracts, suspension of every executive named in the supporting evidence, and a permanent ethics and compliance division with external oversight." "And if we offer a settlement instead?" the general counsel asked. Mia looked at me. I answered for myself. "Then we go public. Press, legal filings, the medical board, the attorney general. All of it. I won't be bought to keep quiet." Another silence. Then Dr. Brooks turned to Karen. "Get started. Prepare internal notices, and notify legal to prepare for temporary leave for Dr. Sloan and Ben Holloway. Effective immediately." It was done. Just like that. The room deflated slightly, like someone had turned off the tension valve, but I didn't relax. Not yet. As we stood to leave, Dr. Brooks said, "Dr. Grant, may I speak with you privately?" Mia raised an eyebrow at me. I nodded. "It's fine." Once the room cleared, Dr. Brooks closed the door gently behind us. "I owe you an apology," she said, her tone softer. "I built this hospital with the belief that integrity mattered more than image. I clearly missed something important." I didn't respond. She continued. "I didn't know what Sloan was doing, not really. But I didn't ask the right questions either." "That's what systems like his count on," I said. "People too busy or too trusting to dig." She nodded slowly. "We'll fix this." "I hope you do." Her next words surprised me. "How extensive do you think the financial manipulation is?" I met her eyes. "Enough to impact your quarterly filings. Enough to raise federal red flags." Her face hardened. She understood. "He'll be gone," she said, "by end of day." As I turned to leave, she asked one last question. "What made you decide to fight? Most people don't." I paused with my hand on the door. "Because if I didn't, the next person would think silence is the only option." If you've ever chosen to speak up when staying silent felt safer, share that moment below. Your story could be the permission someone else needs to find their voice. The days that followed moved both faster and slower than I imagined. By the end of the week, Martin Sloan and Ben Holloway were placed on administrative leave. Not quietly, either. Their names were scrubbed from the directory, and email signatures started auto-forwarding to interim contacts. People whispered, of course hospitals thrive on whispers, but no one spoke directly to me. Not yet. Instead, they watched. I could feel it as I walked down the corridors of Northlake again, this time, not in a white coat, but as a witness to a system unraveling. The IT department initiated a sudden lockdown of all procurement records, especially those linked to Martin's and Ben's user credentials. Compliance officers showed up on site, setting up a temporary office on the 12th floor, with the door labeled simply "External Audit." But that wasn't the part that hit hardest. The real shift came when people started to talk. A nurse from pediatrics stopped me in the hallway, eyes shining. "Thank you. I saw what they did to Dr. Ramos last year." We all did. But no one dared speak. Then a scrub tech from cardiology. Then an administrator from outpatient scheduling. One by one they came to me, not with accusations but with confessions of fear. I didn't know how to say anything without losing everything. They told me I was imagining things. I thought it was just me. The pain wasn't just in the wrongdoing. It was in the silence that followed. On Wednesday of the second week, I was called into the audit room. The lead investigator, a meticulous woman named Rebecca Vance, sat me down and asked me to walk her through the documentation. We spent 3 hours going line by line, the invoice trails, the authorization overrides, the discrepancies in equipment costs and vendor ownerships. She didn't interrupt much. She didn't need to. By the end of our meeting, she closed her laptop, sat back and said, "You realize this might be part of a much larger scheme, right?" I nodded. That's what I was afraid of. What came next was worse but necessary. Rebecca informed me that 3 of the vendors named in the procurement files were now under federal review, not just for overbilling, but for conflict of interest violations tied to personal accounts under Ben Holloway's name. The estimated total, over $1.8 million in inflated charges across 2 years. The number sat like lead in my chest. All that money siphoned from hospital budgets, from patient care, from actual medicine. It made me think of the time I had to delay a scheduled surgery because we lacked updated monitoring equipment. I remembered the apology I'd given to the patient's wife in the waiting room. "I'm sorry, we're waiting on approval for replacements." And all along, the equipment had been bought just at fake prices from the wrong companies, feeding someone's pockets. This wasn't just unethical, it was theft in a white coat. Rebecca stood to walk me out. "One more thing," she said as we reached the door. "We've interviewed 10 employees so far with stories nearly identical to yours. You were just the first to document it." I paused. "No," I said quietly. "I was just the first to refuse to stay quiet." By the 3rd week, Northlake Medical no longer resembled the place I had once walked into with hope in my heart and a stethoscope around my neck. The energy had shifted. Conversations grew hushed in the hallways. Conference rooms stayed booked all day. Department heads met behind closed doors more often. Emails arrived stamped urgent with policy updates and audit notices, and still I kept coming to work. Yes, I had been reinstated. Quietly, legally, without apology. They didn't make a grand announcement. They didn't send out a welcome back email. I wasn't escorted to the OR with fanfare. Instead, I was reassigned to the executive analysis team, reporting directly to the hospital's COO while the investigations continued. They wanted me in the building, just not visible. But they had underestimated me again, because visibility was never my weapon. Documentation was. From my new glass-walled office overlooking the loading dock, I began a different kind of work. I spent each day reviewing compliance protocols, auditing departmental workflows, and cross-referencing everything with the documentation Mia and I had already compiled. But the silence didn't last long. One afternoon, as I walked past the elevators, someone called my name. It was Theo, the young physician I'd once mentored. He stepped into stride beside me, glanced around, and said, "You magnificent, terrifying woman." I laughed. That bad? You have no idea, he said. They've frozen all procurement accounts that pass through Holloway's chain. Locked out half the surgical supply vendors. I heard they're working off backstock and emergency supplies until new contracts can be verified. He hesitated. I looked at those files you told me about, the ones on the shared drive, and they're worse than you said. Once I saw the patterns, I made copies. I've reported it. I paused, looking at him. I should have backed you sooner, he said. I'm sorry. What matters, I replied, is that you backed me now. That evening, the HR department scheduled another meeting, this time with staff. They announced sweeping changes, new financial oversight policies, mandatory ethics training, anonymous reporting tools. But the most unexpected moment came when Dr. Brooks took the stage. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were tired. I take full responsibility, she said, for what was allowed to happen here, for what was ignored, and for the systems that protected misconduct instead of people. She paused, scanning the room. To those of you who saw and didn't speak, I understand. Fear is powerful. But to those of you who did speak, and especially to the one who spoke first, I am both sorry and grateful. Her eyes found mine. I felt the entire room turn. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just stood still. Because this wasn't about credit. It was about culture. And for the first time, that culture was shifting. If you've ever been the first to speak up in a silent room, the first to say, something isn't right, drop a comment. You're not alone. And your voice might be what finally opens a door someone else thought would never move. A week after the staff meeting, everything accelerated. The independent investigators submitted their preliminary findings. The executive board met behind closed doors for nearly 6 hours. Rumors circulated through the hospital faster than lab results during a flu outbreak. And then came the official announcement. Northlake Medical had referred its internal audit findings to the Department of Justice. The procurement fraud wasn't just deeper than expected, it was systemic. There were shell companies' falsified invoices and vendor kickbacks tied to at least 3 executives. It wasn't a rogue scheme. It was a machine. Ben Holloway had already resigned by that point. Unceremoniously. No farewell lunch. No parting email. His office was boxed up overnight and cleared by security before sunrise. Martin Sloan, on the other hand, was still fighting. That's when I got the text. You ruined me. Hope you're satisfied. It came from a blocked number. No name. But I didn't need one. I stared at it for a moment in the break room, then deleted it without a word. Because Martin didn't understand something essential. This had never been about ruining him. It was about refusing to let him ruin me. What he called ruin, I called accountability. The next day, the board offered me a new position, Director of Financial Integrity and Ethics Oversight, reporting directly to the CEO and board. The offer came with real power, full authority to audit, review, and restructure all internal compliance systems. I negotiated the terms carefully: salary, staffing, autonomy. But my first 2 acts in that role had nothing to do with money. The first, I created a new anonymous reporting platform for all staff, clinical, administrative, custodial, with guaranteed response within 72 hours and full protection protocols. No more secrets hiding in policy corners. The second, I walked into the HR office and submitted formal promotion recommendations for Theo and Veronica, 2 people who had backed me when it counted most. They hadn't done everything right, but they had chosen to act. And sometimes the act of choosing matters more than timing. The hospital held its annual all-staff forum the following week. I was asked to speak. I didn't want to. I wasn't a motivational speaker. I was just a woman who had gotten tired of being quiet. But I agreed. I stepped onto the stage, looked out over a sea of scrubs and suits, and told them the truth. 6 months ago, I was told to sign a resignation letter or risk my entire career. I signed it. But I didn't sign what they expected. I told them about the systems that fail when no one watches, about how power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent, dressed in policy and procedures and polite threats. I told them that the strongest people I'd ever known were the ones who spoke up even when they shook doing it. And I ended with this: we can't change what we ignore, and we can't protect what we're too afraid to see. So from now on, I challenge you all not just to speak, but to listen when someone else finally finds their voice. There was a pause, a stillness. Then someone stood. Then another. A standing ovation, yes, but more than that, a shift. The kind you can feel in your chest. After the speech, I stepped off the stage and walked through a crowd of colleagues who now saw me differently, not just as Dr. Emily Grant, anesthesiologist or whistleblower, but as something else entirely. Someone who had dared. I didn't linger. I wasn't looking for praise. But as I reached the lobby, someone stood waiting by the elevator. Luis, the security guard who had once quietly escorted me out of the building. He gave me a slow, deliberate nod. "You said you wouldn't need to come back," he said. "Looks like you came back to change the place instead." "I didn't come back for them," I replied. "I came back for everyone they tried to erase." He smiled. "Well, they see you now." Later that afternoon, I walked back into my office and found a plain envelope sitting on my desk. No name, no stamp. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for lighting the fuse. We were just waiting for someone to strike the match." It wasn't signed, but I had a feeling I knew who it was from. Probably one of the residents, or maybe someone from facilities who had seen too much and said too little for too long. Either way, it didn't matter, because the message was clear. This wasn't my story anymore. It had become ours. That week, the Department of Justice began a formal inquiry. Multiple vendor contracts were subpoenaed. Martin Sloan was officially charged with fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction. The media caught wind and headlines began to circulate. Northlake exec charged in $2 million procurement fraud scheme. Whistleblower doctor exposes hospital corruption. But none of that mattered as much as the internal shift. People began to use the reporting system, not just for fraud, but for harassment, discrimination, burnout, even scheduling issues. And they were being heard. The hospital started to feel different. In small ways at first: a nurse who was rehired after a wrongful termination, a new chief of compliance hired from outside the organization, transparent reporting on equipment budgets posted in the break rooms. It was working. And one day, walking to the cafeteria, I saw Theo, now promoted to assistant medical director, speaking to a group of new interns. I heard him say, "If you see something wrong, say something. Trust me, staying quiet won't keep you safe. It just keeps things broken." I smiled. That's when it hit me, the full weight of what had happened. 6 months ago, I was sitting in a dim conference room with a pen in my hand and fear in my chest. Now I was building a culture where no one else would have to sign anything out of fear again. And if that's not justice, I don't know what is. If you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, or your truth would fall on deaf ears, leave a comment. Because this space, this channel, it's built for people like us. People who dare to believe that even one voice, one document, one moment of courage can tip the scales. 3 months after I changed a single line on that resignation letter, the hospital released its formal internal report. It was 62 pages long. It named names, listed dates, traced every inflated invoice and every manipulated supply order. But what struck me the most wasn't the numbers, though they were staggering. It was the admissions. It was the official acknowledgement that a respected medical institution, one that prided itself on innovation and patient care, had failed. Not because of one man's scheme, but because of an entire structure designed to protect itself before protecting its people. That failure had a cost nearly $2.4 million in fraudulent procurement, dozens of tainted vendor relationships, and more than 20 employees pushed out, silenced, or ignored. When I finished reading the report, I sat alone in my office staring at the final paragraph. This organization acknowledges that silence, when allowed to persist, becomes complicity. I printed that line and pinned it to the bulletin board behind my desk. I wanted every person who came into that office, whether they were board members, interns, or janitorial staff, to see it and understand that this place would never run on silence again. But the victory wasn't without complexity. I still received glares from loyalists to the old guard, There were subtle reminders that change isn't always welcomed passive-aggressive comments in meetings, icy greetings in the hallway. Some thought I'd destroyed a legacy. Others whispered that I was too much or making things political. I didn't engage, because for every whisper, there was a louder ripple. Like when the medical resident I'd never spoken to stopped me near the elevators and said, "Because of you, I'm staying." I was going to leave medicine completely. Or when a new nurse manager told me, "This is the first place I've worked where I believe something will happen when I speak up." That was the legacy I wanted to help build. But there were still loose threads, questions left unanswered. Namely, how deep did this go? And who else knew? Federal agents had already begun interviewing former executives and reviewing banking records. One of the vendors had flipped, offering a full list of contract negotiators involved in the scheme. And then came the rumor that Martin Sloan was offering to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentencing and naming higher-ups. I wasn't surprised. Cowards often crumble when they lose the illusion of control. Still, the thought chilled me, because if he was naming names, I needed to be sure the hospital was ready to face the truth no matter how uncomfortable. Dr. Brooks called a special session with the Board of Trustees. This time, I was invited. Not as a formality, but as an essential presence. The meeting was tense. Auditors detailed potential executive awareness of suspicious contracts. Board members shifted in their seats. Some avoided my eyes, but I didn't blink. When they asked for recommendations, I gave them. Establish a third-party monitoring body to audit vendor relationships quarterly. Require transparency training for all leadership roles. Create an employee truth council and internal advisory group made up of staff from every level. These weren't suggestions, they were non-negotiables. To my surprise, they agreed. And just like that, another layer of protection for truth for people like me was built into the foundation of the place that once tried to bury me. Weeks passed. The headlines faded. But inside Northlake, change had taken root in quieter, deeper ways. One morning, as I walked through the south hallway toward my office, I noticed something small, almost imperceptible. A printed flyer taped to the inside of the break room door. It read, "If something feels wrong, don't ignore it. The system works best when we all speak." No department logo, no attribution, just bold black letters on white paper. Someone had made that. Someone else had posted it, and no one had taken it down. That, more than the policies, the meetings, the reforms that sign, told me something fundamental had shifted. Later that afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at the annual Ethics in Medicine conference held in Denver. They wanted me to share my experience as a case study in institutional accountability. I wasn't sure I wanted to go public beyond the hospital walls, but Mia encouraged me. "It's not just your story anymore," she said. "It's a map for others trying to survive their own." So I went. I walked onto a stage in front of 400 doctors' executives, medical students, and hospital administrators. I wore a simple navy blouse, no blazer, no title badge. Just me. And I began. I used to believe that good people always rose to the top in medicine, that the system would protect patient staff and the truth if we all did our jobs well. But that's not how systems work. I told them about the document I was forced to sign, how I altered it, what came after, the retaliation, the fear, the allies who stepped in, the ones who stayed silent, the ones who eventually found the courage to speak up. "Every institution has cracks," I said, "and the ones who try to patch them with silence are building their legacy on collapse." There was a long pause at the end of my speech. Then someone in the front row stood. Then another. Then another. And I realized something important. This wasn't a standing ovation for me. It was a declaration, a quiet agreement that silence, wherever it lives, must be challenged. After the conference, I walked out into the Colorado sun and turned my phone back on. There was a message from an unknown number. "I lost everything because I tried to do what you did, but I gave up. Thank you for showing that I wasn't crazy just too early." No name, no reply needed. Just confirmation that stories like mine don't end, they ripple. That night, as I sat in my hotel room, I read through the growing list of anonymous reports submitted through our hospital's new system. Stories of misuse, misconduct, and moments where people had previously kept quiet. They weren't keeping quiet anymore. If you've ever been afraid to say the truth out loud but did it anyway, tell me what happened, or tell me what held you back. Either way, your voice matters here, and it might just light someone else's way. Returning from Denver, I found something waiting on my office desk. Not a letter, not a complaint. It was a gift-wrapped box with a hand-scribbled note on top. Thank you for proving the system doesn't always win. V. Inside was a single fountain pen, heavy black metal, elegant. Engraved along the side in tiny serif letters were the words, "What you sign can change everything." I ran my fingers over the engraving, and for a moment I felt the weight of that first day sitting in the HR office, pen in hand, forced into silence. That moment when fear almost won. But it didn't, because one signature had led to all of this. Not the signature they wanted, but the one I chose. And that small choice, that deviation, that spark of defiance had ignited a chain reaction across an entire institution. It made me realize something I hadn't fully processed until now. Sometimes resistance isn't loud. It's ink on paper. It's truth disguised as compliance. It's surviving long enough to fight back differently. The weeks that followed brought even more change. Veronica was promoted again, now head of clinical logistics. Her first act was to overhaul the entire vendor onboarding process. She made transparency a prerequisite for every contract. Audits became automatic, not optional. Theo led a series of internal workshops titled Courage Over Comfort. They were optional at first. But so many people signed up we had to move them into the auditorium. Meanwhile, I focused on long-term restructuring. We rewrote the whistleblower policy from scratch. Not just language updates, complete transformation. Whistleblowing was now rewarded, not punished. Anonymous tips led to measurable responses, and retaliation grounds for immediate investigation and termination. But what struck me most weren't the policies. It was the culture shift. Doctors who used to avoid eye contact now nodded when I walked past. Nurses who had been afraid to speak up now invited me to sit with them during breaks. Even the cafeteria staff, once invisible to most of administration, began submitting ideas through our open feedback loop. A janitor named Daryl emailed me one night. "I've worked here 14 years. First time I feel like someone gives a damn what we think. Thank you." It hit me harder than any award. Because that was the legacy I wanted, not plaques or applause, but a place where people like Daryl mattered. I knew we hadn't fixed everything. Systems don't change overnight. Power doesn't surrender without scars. There were still politics, still whispers, still remnants of the old regime clinging to the corners. But now they were outnumbered. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. That night, I sat in my apartment, pen in hand, and opened a fresh page in my leather journal. I wrote one line. "One day, I'll tell my daughter that I didn't just survive the system. I rewrote it." It had been nearly a year since I'd touched that resignation letter. Since I rewrote the story they tried to dictate. And yet, it still didn't feel like an ending. Because endings are final, clean, resolved. And what I was living in wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something I never expected to create. One crisp October morning, I walked into the hospital not as a whisper of dissent, not as a cautionary tale, but as a leader. Not by title, but by impact. I was invited to participate in the hospital's first leadership roundtable on ethical practice, a newly founded committee made up of cross-functional staff, not just executives. Equal voices, equal weight. We sat in a sunlit room overlooking the helipad, talking not about profits or optics, but human dignity. One of the residents, a young woman named Lila, fresh out of med school, said something that froze the room. "I used to think this place was about rules, but now I think it's about choices." That hit me like a wave. Because that's what it always came down to, didn't it? Not rules, not systems, but the choice to obey or challenge, to protect or expose, to be quiet or be counted. After the session, Lila found me in the hallway. "I want to thank you," she said. "People used to warn me about speaking up. Now they say, ask Emily." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I remembered being her, being warned, being silenced, being watched. I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted to be safe. But sometimes in trying to protect yourself, you build shelter for others too. That evening, I took the long way home. Drove past the old building where I signed that first document, parked, sat in the lot with the engine off, and thought about how fear works. It tricks you into believing you're alone, that no one will care, that it's easier to disappear than disrupt. But here's the truth I've learned, and if you're still watching this, maybe it's the truth you need too. Fear isolates, but courage calls people in. And sometimes you only need one moment, one person, one altered signature, to spark a fire they never saw coming. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own silence or stirred something long buried, I want to hear from you. Wherever you're watching from, whatever time it is, leave a comment, share your story, or just say, "I'm still here," because you are. And this space, this channel, it's not just about revenge or justice. It's about choosing your voice, your truth, your life. And if that resonates with you, then subscribe, and let's keep choosing courage together. I used to believe that peace came from the absence of conflict, that when the chaos ended, when the dust finally settled, I'd feel calm. But that's not what peace really is. Peace is knowing you didn't abandon yourself even when it would have been easier, even when silence was safer. It's the quiet moment when you sit alone with everything you've been through and realize you didn't just survive it, you transformed it. I still have that fountain pen on my desk. The one engraved with what you sign can change everything. Not because I need the reminder, but because I want anyone who sits across from me to see it. To know that power can live in something as small as a line of ink. I don't know what comes next. But I know this. The system didn't defeat me. It didn't erase me. And it damn sure didn't silence me. If you're out there watching this feeling small, erased, pushed out, or told to stay quiet, you're not alone. And maybe this story, this voice is the proof you needed. So if you believe that your voice matters, if you believe that truth is worth fighting for, then let this be our space, our story. Subscribe, share yours, and let's remind the world no one rewrites our lives for us. We do that ourselves.